The last train had already gone. Colt Briggs knew this the moment he pulled his truck off the main road and saw the lights at Harlan Station still burning. Nobody had reason to be there anymore. Not after the 6:15 to Billings had rolled through and taken the last of whoever was leaving this part of Montana for somewhere warmer. Somewhere that wasn't dying quietly under 3 feet of snow. He'd only stopped because he always stopped. Force of habit. The way a man checks a fence line he's already fixed 100 times. Harlan Station sat at the edge of his property, technically the railroad's land, but the railroad had stopped caring about it years ago. Around the same time, it stopped caring about the town of Harlan itself. So Colt checked on it. Fed wood to the iron stove inside when the temperature dropped below zero. Made sure the windows were still whole. He parked alongside the building and sat for a moment, watching the snow come sideways off the mountains. January in this part of Montana wasn't something you described to people who hadn't lived it. You couldn't. The cold had a personality. Mean, patient, personal. It found the gap in your collar, the thin spot in your boot sole. It was the kind of cold that made you understand, on some animal level, that the world did not particularly care whether you survived. He turned up his collar and stepped out. The wind hit him like a door slamming. He pushed into the station. She was sitting in the far corner, half buried in a coat that was too thin for a Montana January. And for a single suspended moment, Colt thought she was dead. Then she moved. She pulled her coat tighter across her chest, and in doing so, turned just enough that the lantern light caught the dark stain on her left sleeve. Not mud, not oil, blood. Dried at the edges, still dark at the center, the size of a man's spread hand. Colt stood in the doorway, the wind screaming behind him, and looked at her the way a man looks at something that is going to change everything, not knowing it yet, but feeling it in his chest like a pulled muscle. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, steady, and completely unafraid. That was the first thing he noticed. She wasn't the kind of woman who startled. She looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they've already decided how to handle, and the problem just changed shape on them. "Station's closed," he said. Stupid thing to say. He knew it the moment it left his mouth. "I know," she said. Her voice was low, even. A doctor's voice, he would come to think later. The voice of someone trained to stay calm when other people couldn't afford to. The train already left. There won't be another one until Thursday. Thursday's 3 days away. "I'm aware." He looked at her arm. She saw him look. "It's not mine," she said. He didn't know what that meant, but something in the way she said it, clipped, factual, already closed, told him she wasn't going to explain it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He crossed the room, fed wood to the stove, got the fire going properly. The station warmed by slow degrees. He didn't ask her anything else, just worked. And when he turned around, she was watching him with those dark, steady eyes. And there was something in her face that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude. It was something older and more complicated than gratitude. It was the look of someone who had not expected kindness and was recalibrating. "There's nowhere in town to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. He already knew. The Harlan Inn had been closed since October, when Martha Reese's hip went out, and she decided she'd spent enough of her life-changing sheets. The only other option was Denny Fisk's trailer park on Route 9, which flooded every winter and smelled like propane even when it didn't. She said nothing. "I've got a ranch," he said. 3 miles north. Spare room. She looked at him for a long time. He had the feeling she was running some kind of internal calculation, not about whether he was dangerous, exactly, but something more nuanced than that. Something about cost and risk, and whether this was the kind of situation she could afford. "I don't know you," she finally said. "Colt Briggs," he said. "I own the Briggs Ranch. You can call the county sheriff's office and ask them about me. They'll tell you I've been boring for 41 years. Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. "Nora Callahan," she said. "I'm a doctor." "The blood." "A patient," she said. "In the car on the way to Billings." He didn't make it. She said it the way you say something you've already grieved and filed away, but Colt heard the thing underneath the words. The exhaustion, the particular weight that comes from carrying someone else's death in your hands. He'd seen that weight before. His father had carried it. Old ranchers carried it after a bad winter. It settled in the shoulders. He picked up her bag before she could object. One hard-sided case and a duffel that felt like it held about 3 days of clothes, and walked to the door. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "We should go." She stood, and only then did he see her sway slightly, a barely there thing, a fraction of a second where her balance shifted and her hand went out to the bench beside her. She caught herself immediately, pretended it hadn't happened. He pretended he hadn't seen it. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." They drove the 3 miles in near silence, the truck bucking against wind gusts that shook the cab like a living thing. The world outside the windows had disappeared entirely into white. "You drive this in every winter?" she asked. "Since I was 16, he said. She turned to look at his profile in the green glow of the dashboard. "You grew up here?" "Born here. My grandfather built the ranch in 1947. My father ran it after him. I run it now. Alone." A beat of silence. "Mostly." She turned back to the window and said nothing else, and he thought that was probably exactly right. She was the kind of woman who understood when an answer was complete. The ranch materialized out of a storm. The main house first, warm-windowed and low-roofed, then the barn, the fence lines appearing and disappearing in the headlights. He'd left the porch light on the way he always did, for no reason, out of nothing but old habit and something he'd never examined too closely. Inside, the house was warm. He'd stoked the fireplace before he left that afternoon, and the coals had held. The main room was heavy with wood and wool, and the faint smell of coffee, and Nora Callahan stood just inside the door and let out a breath that she might have been holding for hours. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." "You don't have to." "I'm making it for myself," he said. "Sit down." She sat. She slept 12 hours. He left her to it. He was up at 5 the way he always was, fed the horses, checked the cattle in the lower pasture, cleared snow from the barn door, did the 1,000 small repairs that a working ranch demanded in January. When he came back inside at 7:30, her light was still off. He made breakfast quietly, ate alone, and left her a covered plate on the stove. When she finally appeared in the kitchen doorway around 8, her hair was loose and her face was bare, and there was a bruise along her left cheekbone that he was certain had not been there the night before. He didn't say anything. He poured her coffee. "I need to call someone," she said. "Phone's on the wall," he said. "Landline. Cell service is rough out here in a storm." She used the landline. He went to the mudroom to sort tack, not to give her privacy, exactly, just because it was something to do. He heard very little, her voice low and controlled, and a silence that went on too long, and then her voice again, and then the click of the receiver. She came and found him in the mudroom. "I need to stay a few more days," she said. "If that's still all right." "It's all right," he said, without looking up from the harness he was repairing. She stood there for a moment, not leaving. "You're not going to ask," she said. "No." Another pause. "Why not?" He set down the harness and looked at her. "Because if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me. And because it's not my business." He picked the harness back up. "But you should put something on that bruise." She touched her cheekbone reflexively. "It looks worse than it is." "Medicine cabinet in the upstairs bathroom," he said. "There's arnica." She left. He heard her on the stairs. He went back to the harness and tried to remember what he'd been thinking about before she walked in, and couldn't. The storm lasted 4 days. In those 4 days, something happened that had no single dramatic turning point. No scene where they looked at each other across a room and understood everything. It was quieter than that. It accumulated, the way snow accumulates imperceptibly, and then all at once. On the second day, she helped him muck out the stalls. She didn't ask to help. She appeared in the barn doorway in borrowed rubber boots that were 2 sizes too big, wearing one of his old work jackets, and said, "Tell me what to do." He told her. She did it without complaint, without conversation, focused and methodical in the way she probably was in an operating room. He watched her with the horses, his gray mare Copper, who trusted nobody, who had bitten 2 farmhands and once attempted to bite the county vet, stood completely still while Nora ran a hand down her neck. "She likes you," he said. Nora looked at Copper with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Animals always do," she said. "They know you're not going to judge them." He thought about that for a while. On the third day, the temperature dropped to -20, and even the wind stopped, the way it does sometimes in that kind of cold, the air gone still and brittle as glass. They stayed inside. He repaired a section of saddle tree at the kitchen table, while she sat across from him reading a medical journal she'd had in her duffel. And at some point they were talking, not about anything important, about the ranch, about medicine in rural areas, about the fact that Harlan had lost its only clinic 3 years ago when the doctor retired and nobody came to replace him. "That's why I was here," she said, looking up from her journal. "I was considering taking the position." He set down the all he'd been using. "What position?" "Someone reached out to me about reopening the clinic. A county health board thing." She paused. "I was supposed to meet with them. But then the accident on the highway, the patient," she stopped. "You tried to save him," he said. "It wasn't a question." "For 40 minutes on the side of Route 12 in the dark," she said. Her voice was flat and even, but her hands, he noticed, had gone still on the journal. He was 23. "How long have you been a doctor?" 11 years. A pause. "It never gets easier. Anybody who tells you it does is lying, or they've stopped feeling things. And I don't know which is worse." Colt looked at her across the table, at this woman who had arrived at his station in a storm with someone else's blood on her sleeve and had somehow, over 3 days of barn work and quiet meals and the specific intimacy of being snowed in together, started to feel less like a stranger and more like someone his house had been waiting for. He didn't say any of that. He picked up the awl and went back to the saddle. "You'd be good at it," he said. "The clinic." She looked at him. "You've known me 3 days. "I've known you 4, he said. "And you didn't panic in a strange man's truck in a whiteout. You mucked 4 stalls without being asked. You read medical journals on your day off. And Copper likes you." He kept his eyes on his work. "That's enough." The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Softer. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. So he did. He told her about his grandfather, who had come here from Oklahoma in 1946 with a war wound in his hip and $200, and the absolute conviction that he could make something from nothing in this hard country. He told her about his father, who had expanded the herd and the land and eventually the debt, and who had died when Colt was 28, leaving him with 40,000 acres and a mortgage that had taken 7 years to pay down. He told her about the winters that had cost him cattle, the springs that had flooded the lower pasture, the summer 2 years ago when the east fence had collapsed in a wildfire, and he'd spent 36 hours riding the perimeter to bring in every animal he could find. He didn't tell her about his wife, but she was there in the silences, the way the dead are, in the chair that nobody sat in, the coffee mug he never used, the second pillow on his bed that was still slightly indented. Nora didn't ask. On the 4th night, the wolves came. He heard them first, that long descending call that rolls off the mountains and gets into your chest before your ears have fully processed it. He was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the clouds break apart, when she came outside and stood beside him. "Wolves," she said. Not a question. She'd heard them too. "Pack that comes through every winter," he said. "They stay to the timber, mostly. Come down when the deer run low." He paused. "They won't bother the cattle tonight. Too cold for them to work that hard." She was quiet, listening. The howl came again, closer this time, rising and falling with the mountain wind. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. He looked at her profile against the dark sky, the line of her nose, the dark fall of her hair, the bruise on her cheek that had faded to yellow-green over 3 days. There was something in her expression he recognized but couldn't name immediately. Then he placed it. Peace. The particular and rare expression of a person whose mind has gone quiet for the first time in a long time. He looked back at the mountain. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Later, when he replayed that moment, and he would replay it many times in the weeks that followed, he would think that was when things changed. Not because of any word or action, but because of that 10 minutes on the porch in the dark, the wolves singing in the timber, both of them standing at the edge of something without knowing what it was. On the 5th morning, the phone rang at 5 a.m. He was already up. He answered it before it could wake her. The voice on the other end was male, controlled, expensive, the voice of a man accustomed to being in charge of situations. "I'm looking for Nora Callahan." I was told she may be in the Harlan area. Colt's hand tightened on the receiver. Who's this? Her husband. A long silence. She doesn't have a husband, Colt said, and then stopped, because he had no actual idea whether that was true, and the man on the other end seemed to know it. We're separated, the man said, and his tone shifted into something that was not quite a threat and not quite a plea. Something in between that Colt found deeply unpleasant. I just need to know she's safe. Can you ask her to call me? I'll let her know you called, Colt said, and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he heard her on the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and took one look at his face and went very still. Who called? She said. He said he was your husband. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the composure was intact, hard one. He could see that now, could see the effort it took. Separated, she said. Almost a year. He's looking for you. I know. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, and now she looked tired in a bone-deep way that went beyond the last week. I came to Harlan specifically because he wouldn't think to look here. Because I needed. She stopped. Started again. I needed somewhere to think, without him being able to show up. Colt sat down across from her. The bruise on your face. She looked at him steadily. It was the first time. And the last. I left that night. A pause. But he doesn't believe in things being over when he decides they're not over. He has resources. He has, she made a gesture he interpreted as lawyers, connections, money, all the infrastructure of a man who has never once had to accept a situation he didn't choose. I'm not afraid of him exactly. I just needed time to handle it on my own terms. How long has this been going on? The marriage? 7 years. The unhappiness? 5. Me realizing I'd been managing someone else's emotions so carefully that I'd lost track of my own. She let out a short, humorless breath. About 11 months. He was quiet for a moment. The clinic job, he said. That's your way out. She looked at him. It's a way forward, she said. There's a difference. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. There is. She looked down at her hands on the table. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how to explain it without, she stopped. Without it being a whole thing, he said. Yes. It doesn't have to be a whole thing, he said. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face then. He would carry that expression with him for the rest of his life. It was the look of someone who had been braced for judgment and had not received it, and didn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. Okay, she said softly. He called the county sheriff himself, that afternoon, and spoke to Dale Purvis, who had known Colt since they were in 3rd grade together, and was the most practical man Colt had ever met. Man by the name of, he looked at Nora, who had heard him start the call and come to stand in the kitchen doorway. Marcus Webb, she said quietly. Marcus Webb, Colt said into the phone. He may try to come to the property. I need him not to. He listened. I'm aware that property rights are complicated, Dale. I need him not to come to the property. A pause. He could hear Dale's chair creaking on the other end. Then Dale said, You got any reason to believe he's a danger? Nora, he said, not looking at her. Show me your arm again. She rolled up her sleeve. The bruise on her upper arm, which she'd explained as a fall, was purple-black and shaped like fingers. Yeah, Colt said into the phone. I got a reason. Marcus Webb arrived the next afternoon. He came in a car that was wrong for these roads, black, low, foreign, the kind of car that announces money in a place where money announces itself by how well you fixed your fence line. Colt saw it coming from half a mile away, a dark shape moving up the road from Harlan, and he was on the porch when it stopped at his gate. He walked down. Webb got out of the car. He was tall, well-dressed even in this weather, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had curdled slightly into something harder and more calculating. He looked at Colt with a specific assessing look of a man who categorizes people by threat level. I'm looking for Nora Callahan, he said. I know, Colt said. I'd like to talk to my wife. She's not available. Webb looked past Colt toward the house. I don't think that's your call. It's my property, Colt said. So it's my call. A silence. Webb's jaw tightened. Who are you to her? Colt thought about that. He thought about a woman who showed up at a train station alone in a blizzard and didn't startle and helped muck stalls without being asked and stood on a porch in the dark listening to wolves and let herself be, for the first time in a long time, simply somewhere safe. Someone who doesn't want you here, he said. I'll call the police. I already did, Colt said. Sheriff Purvis knows you're coming, and he knows about your wife's arm. He held Webb's eyes. Do you want to have that conversation with him? Because he'll be here in about 12 minutes. Webb stared at him. Whatever he'd expected from a man in a barn coat and worn boots standing at the gate of a working ranch in January, it was not this, not the absolute absence of intimidation, the complete refusal to be moved. Tell her, Webb said, his voice dropping, that this isn't finished. Tell yourself, Colt said, that it is. He waited until the black car had reversed down the road and disappeared before he turned and walked back to the house. His hands were steady. His heart was not. She was on the porch. She had seen the whole thing. He walked up the steps and stopped in front of her. And her eyes were bright, not with tears, exactly, but with something that was close to it, something that was its own kind of release. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. He'll get lawyers involved. He'll make things complicated. Let him, Colt said. I've dealt with complicated before. She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was flat and white, the snow silence, complete except for the distant creak of the windmill at the edge of the east pasture, turning slowly in a wind too light to move anything else. Why, she said. Not angry, not accusing, just asking. He could have said a lot of things. He was not a man who had ever found it easy to say what he meant. He'd grown up in a house where love expressed itself through action, through the repaired fence post and the extra blanket on the bed and the tractor running when it hadn't run the day before. He had 41 years of saying things sideways, through work and presence and the particular stubbornness of staying. But he looked at her standing there, this woman who had spent years making herself smaller so someone else could feel larger, this woman who had driven alone into a Montana winter to find somewhere to think, who had sat in an empty train station and looked up at a stranger without fear because she had simply run out of fear, and he thought that some things deserved to be said plainly. Because you showed up in a storm, he said, and I didn't want you to leave. She stayed the rest of January. She met with the county health board in the second week. Colt drove her, waited in the truck, drove her back. She said nothing about the meeting for 2 hours, just looked out the window at the white fields, and then she said, I said yes. Good, he said. It's a mess, she said. The clinic building needs work. The equipment is outdated. They're offering me barely enough to live on for the first year. There's a good carpenter in town, he said. Jake Morales. He does good work, doesn't overcharge. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me it's a mistake. Why would I? Because it's a very small town in the middle of Montana. Yes, he said. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the ranch house. Would you, she stopped. Tried again. I'll need somewhere to stay while the clinic apartment gets ready. Probably 6 weeks. He kept his eyes on the road. There's still a spare room, he said. The 6 weeks became 8. The 8 weeks became spring. Spring in Harlan comes in fits and starts a week of warmth, then 3 days of late snow, then the warmth again, tentative and incremental. The way trust comes back after it's been broken. The snow retreats up the mountains. The pasture goes from white to gray to the specific electric green of new grass. The horses grow restless in their stalls. He found her in the east pasture one evening in late March, sitting on the top rail of the fence, watching copper graze. The light was long and gold, the way it gets in that country in spring, throwing shadows that went on for 100 feet. She had her face turned up to it. He climbed up beside her and sat, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Copper follows you around now, he said. I've been bribing her with carrots, she said. That's cheating. It's medicine, she said, with the ghost of a smile. Build trust with incentives. They were quiet for a while. The spring frogs had started up in the lower pasture, an enormous sound for small creatures. I found a house, she said, in town, 2 blocks from the clinic. It's small, but... Nora. She stopped. He'd been working up to this for weeks, in the way he worked up to most things, slowly, in the margins of other tasks, turning it over while repairing fence lines and hauling feed, and lying awake in the particular silence of a ranch house at 3 in the morning. "I know you need your own place," he said. "I know you need to build something that's yours. I'm not asking you to give that up." He looked at her. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to build it here, with some access to this." He gestured at the pasture, the horses, the mountains going gold in the last light. "With some access to me." She held his gaze for a long moment. The frog sang. Copper raised her head and looked at them and went back to grazing. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," Nora said. Something shifted in his chest. Something that might have been a laugh. It had been a long time since he'd felt one. "I know. You could have at least asked me to dinner first. I make dinner every night. You eat it. That's not the same thing." "Nora." "Yes," she said. Her voice was soft. "Yes. Obviously, yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. In the failing light, on the top rail of a fence on a 40,000-acre ranch in the middle of Montana, two people who had each been broken in their particular way found that the broken places lined up, not perfectly, not without work, but enough. Like fence posts. Like the way a door hangs right when the frame is true. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. It was a Tuesday in April when the clinic reopened. Colt stood at the back of the room while Nora cut the ribbon. He would have been happy to skip the ceremony entirely, but half the town had shown up because half the town had needed a doctor for 3 years, and this was Harlan. And Harlan showed up for things that mattered. He watched her shake hands and smile and answer questions. And he thought about the woman who had sat in a train station in January with blood on her sleeve and the look of someone who had run out of easy options. He thought about how she had looked at him, steadily, without fear, recalculating. He thought about all the things that had had to go wrong in a precise and terrible sequence for her to end up at his station on that particular night. The accident on the highway, the missed train, the storm, the empty town. He thought about luck, and about the way sometimes the worst night of your life is also, from some angle you can't see yet, the beginning of something else entirely. She found him after, when the crowd had thinned. She still had the ribbon in her hand. "You stayed," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him. Outside, through the clinic's newly repaired windows, the main street of Harlan was bright with April light, the mountains visible at the end of the road, still white at the peaks, but green all the way up to the timberline. The town was not large, and it was not young, and it was not easy, but it was alive, and it was theirs, and it was exactly enough. "Thank you," she said, "for the train station." "I was just checking on the wood stove," he said. She laughed. He hadn't expected that, the full sound of it, the way it lit her face. He thought he could spend the rest of his life working to hear that sound, and it wouldn't be enough time. He took the ribbon from her hand and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, because it was hers and he was keeping it, and she understood that without explanation. They walked out into the April morning together. The light fell across them both without preference, the way light does, golden and impersonal and entirely beautiful, warming the road, the old storefronts, the mountains, the new clinic sign, two people standing outside it, her hand finding his in the way that some things find each other, gradually, and then inevitably, and then as if they had always been there. The wolves were still up in the timber. They would come down again when winter came. But winter was a long way off. For all the women who drove into a storm alone, looking for somewhere to think, and found more than they expected. Hope you like this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and like the video. Also tell me in the comment section from where are you watching right now.